This is actually the thinking that we have been playing with together with great colleague, Shyam Sundar, for a few months now. Thinking about what is it that we are doing when we try to model. And of course, first and foremost is what we learn as economists, and Simon has named as substantive rationality. So the idea is there is an actor, there is an outcome. I give certain properties to the actor. I look at the outcome. What do I do when I want to model the whole observed phenomena and make sense towards theorizing this observed action? I use logic. I use logic and rebuild, reconstruct. That's how Vernon Smith calls it, the path from the actor with certain properties to the outcome with, again, specified properties. In the case of substantive rationality, I'm talking about an optimizer who has all the great high levels of computation and information gathering and processing. And he never contradicts himself. He's always well behaved in terms of preferences. It's so cool when you start studying economics that all the regular terms and words are now used with some meaning attached to them. So after a while, you talk amongst yourself and use those words, and other people are actually taking meanings out of that. But you don't mean that meaning. You don't mean fair when you say fair. You don't really mean any of those things when you say well-behaved. It has nothing to do with it. Or when these days we talk a lot about morality of the market, and we mean something completely different from just anyone else outside our circle when we are talking about those things. So here I'm simply talking in terms of what economists consider good and intelligent and proper. An optimizer will get the optimum outcome, and when I want to model that, I use, again, logic, mathematics, and pure optimization ideas in order to reconstruct that path. That's what constructs a model in its entirety. Now, what did Simon do? Simon attacked this idea. He said, you're sitting in your armchair, you don't need anything else, you don't go to the field, you don't look at people. When I'm looking at people, they seem to be doing good enough. And when they are doing good enough, they are not being optimizers at all. They are satisficing. Satisficing was the big thing. Of course, other things built on that. But he started from observing that what is achieved is not the optimum exactly, but is good enough. From the viewpoint of modeling. I'm not really getting into the cognitive side and interaction with the environment and all of that. None of that at all. But just from the viewpoint of modeling, if you look at where bounded rationality comes down to, let's formally model it, the idea is the outcome is good enough, but the agent doesn't seem to require all that many properties that we were assigning to. The point is, as a modeler, when I sit down to reconstruct the path for the agent to get to that good enough answer, again, I'm using the same tools. I'm using logic, I'm using math, I'm using optimization, I'm finding best path. So optimum search routines, optimal ways of how do we model satisficing? We're doing some sort of optimization. When we are, no, you don't like what I'm saying. But the thing that happens here is that we lose uniqueness. We completely lose it because now instead of a unique best answer, we have many good enough answers. And instead of one optimizer, we have many boundedly rational agents. One of them is a satisficer, the other one is the take the bester, and another one is a heurist in the general sense. Maybe he doesn't even know what the heurist is that he's using. So then that would be an intuition user as a heurist. And then maybe minimax and all those other good things also fall into that Savage didn't really want to tackle with his framework that was belonging to the first framework. What are people doing here? In Reconstruction, they're doing the same thing that they were doing with substantive rationality. I mean, and when I say what are we doing, I mean the modelers. But we come up with many ways, many different ways to do it. We have been trying. There are efforts to say, okay, this is bounded rationality. And then some of us don't like it because we say, oh, it's only deviation. That my first impression was that about bounded rationality. So what? You just look at this nice set of axioms and then you deviate from this one and that one? No, you have to change the benchmark. But then all the changing of benchmark and all of that, eventually, when you are actually coming down to it, to operationalize it, same way of reconstruction. I mean, and Lara, you're sitting here, so I have to pay my tribute. So when you were talking about Take the Best, and you wrote that, and when I was studying the 1999 book, what happens with Take the Best, non-compensatory, compensatory, let's think about it, let's think about that. What is it? It's a regression with a certain series of weights, right? And the only thing about that is that the first one would dominate the sum of the rest, right? Still, it fits into the logical reconstruction, doesn't it? Still, it is not really, I mean, you have to, yeah, please.
It is not a regression, it's a linear model.
It's a linear model,
don't forget, in regression you have to compute those coefficients, and it's a lot of work. The linear model is some very simple things, weights, and even in perception, you know, it's a linear model.
Yeah, it depends on whether you're doing the analytical work, which you were doing at that point, or you are actually going at it from the empirical side and trying to find what those might be, right? Which is not what you did, but others did. Okay, so if Lara agrees with me, I'm good. I can just keep going on. Now, in this range of practice as modelers, using the tools that are very well built and they have a high level of rigor, we are basically just looking at an objective function, set of constraints, we can manipulate them, we can do all sorts of things, introduce different things to them, or we can say, well, maybe it's not all about the computation abilities of whatever agent that I'm looking at and his limitations, but also I can go to the other side and change the environment a little bit, and then tune it, and then make it potentially more helpful to the agent. That would be the part of design. That would be when you're looking at the interaction between mind and environment. Depending on which discipline you come from, you give it different labels. Some people took this to the extreme. So for instance, Vernon Smith started asking, what do I really need in order to get the efficient result out of a market mechanism? And he, well, maybe before him was it Chamberlain? Chamberlain had a different question, right? Hirsch, am I right? You disagree with me?
No, I don't. I just don't know enough to answer.
Ah, you are being kind. Okay, so Vernon came up with this really, really nice. I remember sitting in his workshop, and he would come in, nice, long ponytail, Indian. I don't know what they call them. It's not, yeah, a clip Indian here. And then Indian boots, and yeah, completely, you know, excellent. And he was waving an envelope on us. I know what you will do. And he would just sit in the corner and let us shout at each other. And then he would just go to one of us and give the envelope, okay, open it. I have predicted already what the outcome would be. And then, of course, he would explain to us what happened, and others would. But the idea was, he was not going to teach us anything, tell us anything, restrict us in any way. He would just give us some simple rules to play by. And we would shout our bids and asks, and boom. We would get to the equilibrium. It was efficient, it was beautiful, and it didn't take that many rounds, actually. So, what happened when this idea was taken more into the classrooms with running simulations, etc.? A few decades ago, a couple decades ago, Shyam and Dan, so Shyam Sundar, I'm working on this with now, and his colleague, they just were doing this simple thing in the classroom, and they decided, okay, now we're going to enter the game too, and just for fun, we're going to act randomly, completely random, no strategy, no intelligence, nothing, zero. And then look at what happens. And they got efficient outcome. I was like, no, this should be a mistake. Where's the bike? Let's redo it. Let's redo it. No, there's no mistake. So what's working here? The structure. It's the structure that would allow a certain outcome emerge. It only happens if we are not dealing with individuals but groups, and it will be an outcome of very complex interactions, which interestingly now, as modelers, we don't need to worry about. So the main contribution that they made was, okay, if we can see this, then we just leave alone all the reconstruction. Something happens, and then the final outcome emerges. And the final outcome is meeting the criteria that we wanted for without imposing any of the properties and requirements on the actor. So what was working here? Just a simple rule in their double auction, which was you cannot trade at a loss. Done. If you're thinking about it in terms of mathematics, it's still the same problem. It's just that the objective function and the constraints have now switched. So you talk to a mathematician, he says, so what? We always knew it. Dual problems? Yeah, of course, we solve them. So the final solution doesn't change. Nothing, practically nothing is changing in the problem space. You talk to a social scientist, they hate it, they love it, they get excited, and that's the point. It is not, so you've all heard the joke. When an economist gets the Nobel Prize, mathematicians would whisper to each other, oh, another one of these social scientists just inversed a matrix or something similar to that. Like that was for brilliant, right? It's not about that. It's not, for instance, when we look at black holes, it's not the thermodynamics any longer that's important. It's attaching that meaning from the context of the environment we are interested in studying, of the species we are interested in unraveling, of the procedures in the mind that we want to understand, that suddenly takes a shape and already has a form in which we can represent it. That is the whole point of using mathematics in a smart way, in an intelligent way. Now, you'd say, okay, so this sounds very much like substantive rationality. You're still sitting in your armchair. You're using logic. You know what to choose in terms of constructing your objective function and what to put as constraints there and solve the problem. And that's when ecological rationality comes into the picture. So ecological rationality in this sense is the ecological rationality of the behavior or action or a strategy or intelligence of the modeler, not the agent the modeler is modeling. What is that? Look at the environment. Exactly make the substantive procedural. Go and see what happens in the wild, bring it back, give it to modelers who are susceptible to listening and learning from the evidence, and have them revise. And this is what good substantive rationality modelers do too. They use ecologically rational evidence in order to fine-tune and improve their models. The method doesn't change. It is still the logic. Ecological rationality comes into the picture when you gather the observation and use the feedback to then revise the properties, the initial properties that you were imposing on your actor in order to get to whatever the ideal outcome or the observed outcome is. So what happens in the case of ecological rationality and reconstruction when you are restricted to optimization both for your agent and your outcome and the reconstruction of the path is that you get strategies. You get many strategies, and then you find best strategies. And then when you want to compare between models, you compare on some metric, such as efficiency, what that strategy can deliver for you. So you will end up with some optimal strategy. What else happens is that you can just keep going on and modifying. In that sense, you are ecologically rational as a modeler. However, the governance of optimization on the entire process of your work and analysis stays there. It is considering still always an optimizing agent, depending on how you define or require the properties, and an optimum outcome will come out of that. Now, the interesting thing is that in this case, descriptive and normative can coincide. Once you resolve to the final outcome, then you would say, okay, this is what I've done substantively, and now I can use it to make recommendations, to provide solutions, to give advice, this and that. In the other case, however, when you are using a still logic to reconstruct, you do the same thing if you are a fair modeler. You take the observations and whatever they imply as a feedback in order to modify your agent and his properties. You would end up with many different ways through logical procedures to get to your good enough outcome. But it is only descriptive. You have no way of producing something that can be a unique benchmark against which things are being calculated. Now, again, I want to emphasize here, when I speak of ecological rationality for a modeler, I don't mean the ecological rationality in the sense of normative implications that fast and frugal heuristic is suggesting. That would be when you as a modeler are looking at the actor and trying to decide whether what they are doing is good enough or not, or better than another thing, and it's always comparative. It is always comparative. It is never absolute. Am I right? Thank you. Okay. So, yes, I can actually stop after this. So the difference then appears when we are talking about a completely mathematically equivalent format, which is the dual problem of the first problem. But then what the modeler is focused on now has changed because the context of the problem is different. What I'm interested in is to make sense of what happened in the market, let's say. I'm not going to worry at all about what the interactions were. How did the mind and environment interact? None of those things. I am taking the outcome as given, and look at how much intelligence is required for the agent. Can they act completely randomly? We are now actually developing this software. And we start with random bits and asks that follow that simple rule. And we still go up to 96, 97% of efficient outcome. So the difference then is in what we produce as a modeler. When you consider minimal or random rationality for your agents, the zero intelligent agent, there is no strategy. It's a sans strategy approach to the study of behavior. That is the main difference, not the mathematical solution, which you can do one way or in the dual way. Strategy is completely eliminated, and that's why I chose this title today. How much intelligence is required for a strategy? We are so worried about the strategies when we do human behavior studies. We are talking about how good a strategy is. Could it be better? Can we find easier ones? Is this too hard? Is this too simplistic? Is it too complex? That entire set of questions is now put to rest. I don't know. And in fact, as a modeler, I don't care. And in fact, as a person who wants to develop theory, I don't need to care. And that is so empowering, especially if we want to deal with macro level problems, which is my current recent interest. So when we move from focusing on individuals, looking at them trying to reconstruct the path, and then finding out along the way how many troubles are there because we are using a certain set of tools that worked really well when we were doing it, but now doesn't work well. And then we think about heterogeneities, and then we just build on that and go on, and then the problem gets too complex. In fact, everyone who's doing bounded rationality modeling would end up with much more complex models than the first cute, beautiful models that we had under substantive rationality. Thank you. And so, if the goal, and it's always important to have the goal in front of us when we attempt our scientific search. What am I interested in now? I'm interested in finding solutions, recommendations, benchmarks maybe, or a way of comparison that applies to groups, to societies. So I can speak to policymakers and regulators and make sense to them, and at the same time provide them with something tangible. Contrary to the existing or dominant wisdom that we need to go deeper and deeper and deeper into what is that path? What is that process? How do the interactions work? Maybe we can just leave the whole thing and go to the end of the spectrum and think about emergence. Then we have also gained a big advantage, because now all we need are intelligent designs. And those I know, and they are so manipulative, but for the greater good. Someone has to do something. Meanwhile, while we are getting to that ideal, I feel that the old ideal of becoming fully rational is now replaced by the new ideal of let's make sense of all the processes. And I don't think it's worth it. So in my simple cost-benefit analysis, we are not really producing as much good by going deeper and deeper into this, depending on what it is that we want to produce. But I know for myself that I want to produce something that policymakers and regulators can use. And in order to do that, what would be very powerful for me is to shed everything that makes my work as a modeler, as a scientist, as a consultant, harder and more complex, and therefore less accessible, into something that can be put to work. And my feeling so far is that one way to go about it is to just leave all the fuss, the new fuss, which has now replaced the fuss for whether the norm was correct or not, and move to the extreme other side of the spectrum of modeling, which is mathematically equivalent, and produce what we want to get out of it. The way to go about it is dropping the strategies, building them, modifying them, and instead designing the rules as simple as possible without trying to specify the requirements for the actors. That is a losing battle to me. So people are really different. We can treat them as being different, then we have to work on some representative agent. That seems to have already lost its attraction in many circles. Or we can think about them as a multitude of differences and then try to specify them. Again, I'm not sure how practical that is. But if we take this step and just leave all of that, I see some light at the end of the tunnel and some quick outcomes, actually, based on which we can take the steps until, I don't know, the day when the new obsession ends in something really revolutionary in terms of our theories and modeling, or be replaced by something else. So, conclusion, how much intelligence do I need in my strategies, in my agents, in my policymakers, in my, whatever it is that I'm trying to reconstruct? It really only depends, in practice, on the structure.
Thank you. So one question. Go ahead.
So to what extent do you think that this is the approach biologists actually follow when they study non-human populations that are able to construct very complicated environments for themselves, develop a sense of adaptive heuristics in order to function, survive, and thrive, and yet, as far as we can tell, lack the brain power, shall we say, to actually engage in anything closely approximating rationality or optimizing behavior.
It is actually a brilliant example. It exactly matches that. So what emerges when we rid ourselves of the obsession of I have to know how it emerged can be just taken at face value and worked with. So that is a brilliant example for what I'm trying to convey.
Thank you again,
Thanks.
Shabnam. And I welcome our next